Okay, so welcome. This is the start of the next learning module. And as the lecture title for lecture 28 suggests, it's going to be fun. We're going to have all kinds of fun. That is, we're going to start with the alkyne functional group. So this is the CC triple bonded functional group. And I'm sorry for that pun, but I'm also not sorry. So anything with a carbon-carbon triple bond is considered an alkyne. Now, as is tradition, we should go through some naming and some properties and that sort of thing. So the first thing that we'll mention, I think, is the IUPAC naming. And basically, it's a lot like alkenes, except instead of the -ine suffix, you're going to have an -ine suffix on the parent. So -ine is Y-N-E, both in spelling, and then -ine for the pronunciation. So the other things to consider that we had to worry about with alkenes is E and Z, but EZ/cis trans, these don't apply for alkynes, excuse me. And that's because the alkynes are linear. And they only have one substituent on either side of the carbon-carbon triple bond. So if we look at an example, we've got a nice alkyne drawn in a 6-atom system. Okay, so here we would have 3-hexyne instead of 3-hexene or just hexane. We just want to make sure that we're linear about these things, but otherwise they're pretty easy to name. If we had another molecule, we could have 1-butene. Whenever there's a 1, we know that it's at the end of the chain. So there's 3, linear goes to 1, 2, 3, carbon 3, and then off up to 4, carbon 4 for my 4th atom in my bond line structure. So not too bad to name without the easy issues. You don't have to struggle too much there. Just make sure the numbering is on point. So for example, if you had 1,2-dichloro 3-heptyne, okay, that is 3 heptynes. So we've got here's our hexyne. So where do we attach our methyl group? Well, that's kind of dictated by the chlorine atoms. So I put my methyl group down here where I've got carbons 1 and 2. We're going to go from right to left to give things a lower number. 3 starts the alkyne into 4, but we don't need 4 for this numbering. It's not a 3-4 heptyne. It's just a 3 is the start heptyne. And then 5, 6, 7. Okay. So that's naming, like I said, not too bad, but let's get into the properties of these things generally before we get into the reactions that they undergo. So alkyne properties. Are as follows. There is 2 C atoms, 2 times carbon atoms with 3 covalent bonds. That's a really roundabout way of me saying we have a carbon-carbon triple bond present. So we have 3 bonds between 2 carbon atoms. Where do they come from? Well, 1, we have our lowest energy bond. That's a sigma bond. Really strong. Because sigma bonds are generally strong, we have head-to-head overlap of hybridized orbitals. And so the pi bond now is weaker than sigma. And so this comes from the side-to-side overlap of 2 orbitals. And then orthogonal or perpendicular to that is a second pi bond. And the second pi bond is weaker than both the sigma and pi bonds. So when we draw 3 lines between 2 atoms, we have to recognize that one of them is very strong, 2 are weak, where the first of the weaker bonds is incredibly weak and incredibly reactive. I mean, it's unwise, but we could go ahead and use a piece of paper to try to depict how the atomic orbitals could overlap to give rise to our carbon-carbon triple bonded system. Now it's unwise because it's going to get complicated. So here's a head-to-head overlap of two kind of traditionally hybridized orbitals. I show an elongated lobe overlapping head-to-head fashion with the carbon on the right. Now we then have an unhybridized p orbital, which I'll have along the y-axis, doing side-to-side overlap with this an orbital going parallel to it on the opposite carbon, and then across the z-axis we have two more unhybridized p orbitals, one on each of the carbons, and those are overlapping with each other, but they're orthogonal or perpendicular to the first orbitals that are trying to side overlap. It's a lot to fit in, right? It's a lot of bonds for these carbon atoms, and so as a result, we have a pi bond that is very reactive, the first one. So we let the first pi bond react, and then we have an alkene, and alkenes do alkene things, not as quickly maybe as the first alkyne was able to react for a lot of reasons. So the first pi bond is highly reactive. And what you get then is if you take your carbon-carbon triple bond, which is your alkyne, what you end up doing is a fast pi bond reaction to give a carbon-carbon double bonded species, which then does a normal pi bond reaction to give a carbon-carbon single bonded species. Now it's important to note these pi bond reactions are just the reactions of alkenes that we looked at previously. Okay. So these include things like hydrogenation, hydrohalogenation, hydration, halohydrin reactions of sorts. There's a lot of reactions that we can do that we've already talked about, some that don't work so well. I don't think I've ever seen or thought, I know I've thought about it at some point, but I don't know what happens if we try to ozonize an alkyne. I'm going to look that up between the next two lectures. But anyway, so we're going to see a lot of the same reactions, just happening twice. And that's a really important feature about alkynes that's helpful as you're trying to study and learn these reactions. Alkynes react like two alkenes. Okay, so we think about it as the extra bonds just providing another site for reaction under the reactions that we've already seen. And so let's look at some examples. Let's do hydrohalogenation. Okay, so I'm going to take an alkyne and I'm going to pick on, I really like to have something that has a hydrogen on one side and a carbon atom on the other side, because then we can study things like the Markovnikov rule. And indeed, what you get if you start with something like this and add an excess of HBr is you add hydrogen and halogen atoms to the alkyne, hence a hydrohalogenation. So let me first count 1, 2, 3, 4. I get a little screwed up personally when I have the linear arrangement. So I have 4 carbon atoms. So I have my 4 carbon chain now with everything being tetrahedral and sp3 hybridized. What I'm going to see is that I have my hydrogen that I started with. Now, in addition to the hydrogen that I started with, I'm going to have 2 more hydrogens on the carbon that had the hydrogen. And then on the internal carbon, we're going to have Br atoms. Okay? So we've done hydrohalogenation, hydrogen and halogen, hydrohalogenation twice. 2 HBRs added across our alkyne system. Now, what's the mechanism for this? First of all, let's recognize that there's a substituted side and an unsubstituted side. Whenever I've got an alkyne with some R group on one side and a hydrogen on the other side, I've got a substituted side and an unsubstituted side. Okay. So what we have to realize is that the Markovnikov rule is going to be involved here. So with the Markovnikov rule, under acidic conditions, we're going to add our nucleophile to the more substituted position. Let's see how that looks in our reaction. What I'm going to do is first take my alkyne and consider a resonance structure where I've moved the electrons over so I can see why a hydrogen might at all be interested in the reacting with this molecule. So I have my resonance arrows. I'm going to plop the electrons over on the less substituted side, leaving behind a positive charge on a more substituted side. Now, it might be a little unusual, but we don't want to move nuclei when we're drawing resonance structures. That is to say, we don't want to let bonds rearrange. We're just moving the electrons without changing the positions of the actual atoms. What I'm trying to get at is if I started linear, I need to finish linear, even though I've redistributed the electrons. So now I have a negative charge due to electrons being localized on the right side. I don't want to, I know I want to make that zigzag and not linear, but I can't because I started linear and my resonance structures all need to be linear. Okay, we have a positive charge on the left carbon. That's going to allow us to see why an H plus will want to react at the right side carbon atom. The negative charge could attack the positive charge on the hydrogen cation to give rise to this species, which is now sp2 hybridized on the right carbon, but still linear and sp hybridized on the left carbon, or the more substituted carbon, as I should say, because we can go left and right, the molecule can roll around and that sort of thing. And so now we have the Br minus adding to the positive charge. That's going to give rise to the product from our first hydrohalogenation reaction. That is to say, now we're going to have a Br added where the positive charge was, two hydrogens on the unsubstituted carbon now, and then our ethyl group. Now we don't need to worry about, we have an alkene intermediate, but we don't need to worry about E and Z here because we have two hydrogens on the right side, so E and Z does not apply. Okay, now you might be wondering, where did this H plus come from? That was from the HBr, which is a strong acid, so we have H plus available to us. We protonated the alkyne to make what's called a vinyl cation, which is indeed linear and was then accessible to reacting with Br minus. Now, we're not done yet. We actually can't stop at this point because if this molecule was generated, it would also react with HBr. So we just get a mess. If we only added like one stoichiometric equivalent of HBr, we couldn't stop here. We get a mess of unreacted starting material, alkene intermediate, and what's ultimately the final product, the dihalogenated or dihydrohalogenated product. That is to say, this is an alkene, and alkenes react with HBr using the Markovnikov rule, or maybe you want to consider a resonance structure where we put the negative charge on the more substituted position, leaving the positive charge on the less substituted position. We let the negative charge engage with H plus, which is available from HBr. That's going to give rise to a cation intermediate, which is highly reactive in the presence of something with even marginal nucleophilicity, like a halogen anion. So the Br minus will come in and add, and I forgot the positive charge, excuse me, there we go. We add to the positive charge to give rise to our final product, which is just a result of a sequence of two hydrohalogenation reactions. So we've added two HBRs across our triple bond to give rise to a product. So a lot of the stuff we look at will look similar to this. That is, we can do just two of the reactions we had done in the past. We could look at another example, an example that I don't want you to worry about the mechanism for. I want you to be aware that this hydrohalogenation, just like before, followed the Markovnikov rule. H plus goes at the less substituted position, which has a hydrogen. Br minus goes at the more substituted position. You know, though, before we move on to another reaction, let me just take a second to clarify something. Let's say I've got something like this. Now, in this alkyne, if I reacted this with HBr, I'm just going to say mixture of products here. And don't worry, this is not a fair org2 question. Now, the reason why we get a mixture of products is that both sides of the alkyne are substituted. You might be like, well, but the hexyl is more substituted. I'm focusing more actually on the carbon atom that's part of the alkyne. What's attached to it? Does it have another carbon attached to it, or does it have a hydrogen attached to it? If it has a hydrogen on one side, a carbon on the other, then I can easily see which side is more substituted and less substituted. Over here, these are both substituted, so what you would get if you did this reaction is kind of a mixture of products related to a relative stability of two vinyl cations that you wouldn't be able to necessarily predict with ease. And so this is just both substituted. This is not a fair Markovnikov question. Okay, so I couldn't ask you, I mean, I could, and then you could all destroy me in my evals or something like that. I mean, it just wouldn't be a fair question, right? If I was grading it, I'd be like, ooh, how do they know? And this is just one of these where the reaction would take place, but you wouldn't know the outcome unless you actually accidentally went into the lab. What we could do is something that gives rise to the same thing on either carbon atom of the alkyne. That is, what if instead of HBr, we did the dihalogenation reaction, Br2? Once again, we have this in excess, as though we want to do the reaction that I'm speaking about on both sides. And so whenever we have Br2, if we don't have water around, we know we're doing a dihalogenation reaction. A dihalogenation reaction. And so what we're going to do is take our two carbon atoms from the alkyne and have Brs on both sides. Okay, now I don't want to worry about a mechanism for this particular reaction. I know we could think about bromonium intermediates, especially for the second Br2 adding, but I don't want to go down that road. There'll be enough mechanisms to worry about in the class, so let's not worry about actually having to push arrows. Instead, we'll think about how to solve this problem. That is, what you want to do is recognize the carbon atoms that are part of the alkyne, delete the two extra bonds, so there's only a single bond between those two carbon atoms, and replace those double bonds that were lost with bromine atoms. So there are two bromine atoms at each of the alkyne carbons. So there's a net addition of 4 bromine atoms being added. Okay, so I think that's a good introduction to the functional group, the alkyne. We'll look at some more reactions in upcoming lectures. So until then, I'll see you next time.